You know, it's a common problem to have these pieces of mica completely disintegrate on these tuning condensers. The little trimmers here. The mica resides in between the two plates and allows some fine tuning for each section of the tuning condenser. You can still buy the mica sheets and cut your own, but let me show you what I used in this particular tuning condenser, and I'll share the results I got using my LCR meter as well. I started going through some of my surplus material and just looking for a real thin plastic. I knew I had some that I had used in the past. Not this particular material, but something very close to this. This is a piece of capped on tape, and what I'm doing is just leveraging the plastic backer. So if you take a mic and check the thickness of the mica pieces, somewhere around 2.5 1/1000ths of an inch, and this right here is about 2 1/1000ths of an inch. So that works out well. Of course, there's a little bit of difference in the dielectric constant of the material itself, but the results are very close. I took that one piece of mica that was good and cranked this thing all the way down, and then replaced the mica with the modern day plastic, and I can get within about 3 to 5 picofarads. So if that becomes problematic, I'll shop for some mica sheets. But for now, when we get this radio going, I'll try to do the RF alignment here using you know, the plastic material in there in lieu of the mica. Just wanted to share that. And you guys saw, you know, the work that I did on the tuning condenser. So we're ready to get this remounted. I think I'm going to go forward and get this mounted back in the chassis, and then we'll go over here to the pre-selector coil, and you can see that I've got to clean it up just a little, and we'll get it mounted in and tied in. And it looks kind of complicated. So you may be asking yourself, you know, where the heck does this thing go, and how does it tie in to each of the 3 sections on the tuning condenser? I'll try to explain that and reference the schematic so you guys can follow along with me. Okay, before we start mounting the tuning condenser back in here, one thing I wanted to point out, I was trying to figure out what this wire right here goes to. And when you look at it, it looks like it's grounded, but you'll notice it's actually a pull-through. So it looks to me that this was the wire management system that was used for the antenna lead for the radio itself that would attach back over to the pre-selector coil. So right interesting. What I want to do is clean this up and go ahead and put a modern day pushback cloth wire in here, and make this just a little longer as well. So we'll start out doing that before we start attaching the tuning condenser back to the chassis. I'll probably go ahead and do most of this off camera, but you guys can see what they've done here. And I'm just opening these little clips back open here, and that's the wire that was used. So at first glance I thought it was really a chassis ground, but nothing more than appears to be just wire management. Pretty clever though, if you think about it. And if someone's in here pulling on the antenna lead, which happens a lot, and you've seen that with some of my other videos, you have a problem with that antenna coil. So let me engineer something else here to take the place of this. I've got some blue pushback wire here that I'll be using, cloth covered. And if I recall correctly, that was one of the standards, I believe, blue for antenna lead, and I'll just loop it through here as such. Now I'm going to build up this area here with a little heat shrink, and then just tighten that back down, and then leave maybe 4 to 5 inches of wire back here. Let's go ahead and use a small piece here. I'll cut this in half, 3/32 inch heat shrink, and I'm going to just go ahead and mark these locations with a black marker. We'll slip that on. And I may build that up with another layer here. Let me throw a piece of 1/8 inch heat shrink over these now. Okay, let's see how this works out. I think that looks good. You guys probably noticed I was using this ball container here underneath the chassis at this point just to do the support, to show the underneath side. And I've got another one over there as well, but inside of here are my screws or fasteners, and I just wrapped up inside some painter's tape. So here's my fasteners for the tuning condenser. Tube shield. That's the one I'm looking for. I notated it long coil mounted to the front of the chassis. And I may have to derust these. Let me just check them out real quick and see what they look like. Okay, they do need just a little bit of derusting here. Let me see if we can do that real quick within 5 to 10 minutes, and I'll see if I can find something else to occupy my time. I'll touch more on rust inhibitors here toward the end of the series, but I'm going to use some crud cutter. And this actually not only is a good rust removal product, it's also one of the rust inhibitors, real similar to Piclic's 20. And shake this up, and it shouldn't take but probably 10 minutes or so. Let's check our progress now and see what we've got. Okay, here they are. They cleaned up pretty good. Just used a little bit of my abrasive pad. After about 3 or 4 minutes of soaking there in the crud cutter. And then, to act as a rust inhibitor, almost let them dry naturally, and then just some forced air from a distance leaves that coating of the crud cutter on there. Should act as a good rust inhibitor. A little housekeeping here before we get started. Let me go ahead and clean up these solder lugs here. This one on the bottom and the 2 on the top. Okay, got the 2 solder lug connections here on the top cleaned up. Also went on and cleaned this with alcohol, and the bottom connection down here as well, and the ground location here. Let me grab my large soldering iron, and I just want to go ahead and affix a solder loop location here that we'll need to attach that mica cap that was attached here to the frame, and we'll show that on the schematic here a little later on. You can see I've got a wire bent around here going inside the frame, and I'll have a nice little lead to use the coil method or other to attach the components back to the frame. A little bit of flux. I've already cleaned this area really well with alcohol. Okay, let's let that cool. That looks really good. That's an underneath shot and back from the top. Let me clean just a little bit more right in this area. Alright, let's check the DC resistance here. I'm going to go between the frame and my solder location here. Looks great. Before I go to the trouble of mounting this back in, I'm going to check one more time just to make sure I don't have any shorts between the stator, that being the solder lug locations, and the rotor, which rotates and is attached to the frame. So you can see I've got my negative lead attached to the frame itself, which is the rotor, and I'm going to go down here to each section, checking here first. And we'll go over to the continuity mode, and let me just go ahead and run this capacitor through its range. Okay, that section's good. Now we'll move here to the middle section. Alright, that's good. And then this was the section that was problematic. Okay, it's still good. Just wanted to make certain. Alright, let's go ahead and get the tuning condenser mounted back in here. Okay, I think that's the way it was mounted, and I'm in alignment here, and I think there's one fastener on the front as well. I tell you, before I get too far along here, check out the schematic itself. I highlighted in pink the tuning condenser, and you can see the three sections. One being here in the oscillator section, more or less the antenna section, and of course the RF up here. And this is what's called the Pre-Selector Coil. So that represents the three different sections. I tell you what I'm going to do. You can see my connection point here back to L5, that little small oscillator coil, and that's the one that I had the yellow shrink on. It went back to the 220 picofarad capacitor that I put in place, and that's location number 3 on the oscillator coil. Let me go ahead and solder up a yellow lead back from that point over to the tuning condenser, and then you can see the other side of the tuning condenser itself, which is the rotor, represented by the bottom half of the symbol. You can see it curved, representing rotating, and it attaches to ground. So let me look for a suitable location for ground, and go ahead and make that other connection point that I just talked to as well, yellow, back to the stator itself. The section of the tuning condenser that's being used as the oscillator section, looking back at my notes, was this rear section. And if I flip this over, you'll see my solder to location right here. So that's why I want to go ahead and get the lead attached before I actually mount this, just to simplify things. And right here's that connection point on the oscillator coil. So my short jumper, I'll run from here do some wire management back through here. We'll go down right through here, right to the lug on the tuning condenser. With the oscillator wire soldered in here, I'm going to just go ahead and finger tight two of the fasteners here on the back, just to hold the tuning condenser in place. There's the lead coming over, and you can see the wire management here. And I'll just bring this over here and solder this in, get this cleaned up. Let me study the ground location. I'm out of the black pushback wire, but this brown will do. Let me let that cool and I'll clean that up. I think I'd mentioned this would come in handy for a ground location. It's the cut-off terminal strip that I use for the diode, and I'm definitely going to use it and make this my ground location. I may be a little too close to the camera here and out of focus, but there's that ground lead connection and the wire management here. Looks nice and neat. Here's the fastener location, and you can see I'm just using my thumb here to align the tuning condenser. And I don't have a magnetic screwdriver, but we'll make one real quick. Go ahead and snug those others down at the back. Got that mounted and in place. And you can see here the other fasteners that we threw in there, and the crud cutter are looking really nice now. And let's get that coil mounted back to the chassis. Alright, let's recap what we've done. I had already noted the areas I highlighted in pink, here, here, and here, were the three sections of the tuning condenser. This is the first section that we just tied to, that being the oscillator section, with one lead going to ground, and then the other lead going to the solder lug that tied back to the number 3 connection on the coil. So this is complete. Let's take a look at the coil up here, L1, just a little closer. I have photos of where to attach things back to, but let's say I didn't. Can we figure it out using the schematic itself? Take note of the clearance between the fabricated reproduction capacitor box and the tuning condenser. I'm glad I went just a little bit less width here. Anyway, nice fit, no rubbing, and hopefully the speaker itself will not be problematic. I've tried to adjust my camera here where we can see the tuning condenser, the schematic, as well as the L1 coil, which is the pre-selector coil. And it mounts in to the chassis and attaches back to the circuit in the orientation that we see. So let's go back to the schematic just for a moment. We'll start over here at location number 1, and you can see that comes up to the antenna itself. So location number 1 on the coil is right here, and that's where we'll connect that blue lead that I wrapped up here that exits the rear of the chassis. If you go in a clockwise position, location number 2 is here, and that's capacitor C1.001. That would be, I think, 1,000 picofarads. And I think when I read this, it was just north of 750 picofarads. We'll get that replaced. So that gets the primary side of this section of the coil. And if you go to the secondary, location number 3, it's located right here. You can see I've got a small jumper attached, and you can see it attaches itself back to the tuning condenser, that being the stator. And we've already said the stator were the solder-on lugs. And that would be these locations here. This one is the oscillator section that I've already tied in from underneath. So these two are available. If you go to the next connection point, number 4, right here, you can see I've got a short stub off back to ground, as well as attaching to the rotor section of the tuning condenser. We'd already checked this tuning condenser is tied to chassis ground, so the rotor and the frame are the same. So no connection point is needed at 4, other than just tying the coil, this connection here, back to that little stub that we created here on the frame. So that takes care of this section of the coil. Then if you look back here at 5 and 6, 5 and 6, you'll see 5, this location here, has 2 different leads coming off. You can see, if this is showing up here on the camera, I've got one that's a grid lead with a grid cap. And you can see that's indicated on the schematic right here. If you follow L1 connection point 5 all the way across, it comes down to the grid of the 6 alpha 7 tube. And that's tying in to the other stator on the tuning condenser, which again would be one of these 2 connection points, whichever one we select or it lines up with. And the other side, if you go down here and look at L1 connection point 6, which is back here, you can see I've cut a wire off. So we'll clean this up, dress it up, put a new lead on. We'll route a new lead underneath, and this will tie in to the junction point of Charlie 2 and R1. And that's actually on that first resistor board underneath the chassis. So that will be my tie-in point. Looks complex when you look at it here, but when you just take time to break it down and look at your documentation, not quite so bad. Let me go ahead and get this thing mounted, soldered back in place, and we'll take a look at the results. You can see I've got the L1 coil back in the radio, and I've just got to solder everything in. I did double check my DC resistance, and everything still looks good. And I did a quick dry fit of my speaker as well, because you can see how tight it is to be able to slip that speaker with the field coil, output transformer, everything back in this area. And I just bent this tab back right here, solder tab location on the L1, just a little to create some additional clearance here. I've got the fasteners here tightened down, and of course they were de-rusted. And let me go ahead and get everything tied in here to each side of the tuning condenser. And the other thing that worked out really good, this is showing up the ground location itself for the one connection here off the coil, as well as that Mica cap tie-in point. Still got to run a jumper from here back down over to that R1 and just get this little terminal piece of a terminal strip here that was soldered on that provides support here for the coil on the rear. Get that taken care of, and then this piece will be complete. I got this last area tied in here, and you can see the way I've got the wire routed back down. I think before it looked like it was on the other side of the capacitor box, but when I look, I've only got about maybe a 1/4 of an inch or maybe even an 1/8 of an inch clearance here between the rotor itself and the capacitor box. So I don't want that lead hitting in that area, so I think this will work well. And I'll clean this up a little bit more once I get the tubes and speaker itself mounted. I'm going to go ahead and get the chassis off the workbench for now, and get the speaker over here so we can go ahead and dress up the field coil and output transformer leads.